Welcome to the My Lotus Moments podcast, the podcast for women of color to have open and honest dialogue about experiences that we all share, from dating, relationships, mental health, and everything in between. I'm your host, Hope Coleman, a licensed social worker and mental health advocate and coach. To get more information and resources, visit the website at www.hopeinher.com. Let's get started. Hey guys, and welcome to episode 21 of the My Lotus Moments podcast. Have you ever believed your partner or someone you were dating to be a narcissist? Ask yourself these questions. When something goes wrong, does my partner blame everyone but himself or herself? Does my partner refuse to be accountable for his or her bad behavior? Does my partner believe he or she is always right? Is my partner unable to tune into my feelings or my children's feelings? Well, today, Dr. Natalie Jones will help us understand how narcissists think and what it's like being involved in a relationship with them. Dr. Natalie Jones is a California-based licensed professional clinical counselor and psychologist with a private practice, lifetime counseling, and consultant. She is an expert at what she does with experience and training as a therapist with the Federal Bureau of Prisons, Department of Probation and Pretrial, California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, where she conducted her own research. She earned her bachelor's degree in psychology and a minor in criminal justice from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. She later attended East Carolina University, where she completed double majors in biology and chemistry. After that, she went on to obtain her master's degree in clinical counseling psychology from the California School of Professional Psychology. She then completed her doctorate degree of psychology at the California School of Professional Psychology at Alliant University in San Francisco. Dr. Jones' area of expertise include post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, forensic mental health, and relationship issues, particularly those with narcissists. Dr. Jones is also the host of A Date with Darkness podcast, a podcast dedicated to those who have been hurt by love and abuse through their relationships with narcissistic people. To learn more about Dr. Jones and listen to her podcast, click the links in today's podcast show notes. Let's get started. Okay, so the first question I have for you is, how do you define narcissism, and how exactly does that fit into relationships?
Yeah, so, I feel like that's a difficult question. And the reason why I feel like it's not a difficult question, but a multi-layered question, I should say, because narcissism is defined so many ways right now in our culture. It's one of those words that people are kind of using now, where they're saying, oh, my ex-boyfriend, he was so narcissistic, or my ex-girlfriend, she was so narcissistic. And then we have, so we have that sort of, that I guess you could call that pop culture or socio-cultural aspect of narcissism. And then we have the actual narcissism, which is defined by what I go by when I'm treating patients, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is basically the manual of psychiatric diagnosis. Mm-hmm. So to answer your question, I'm going to try and do my best to say what it is in the first part. A lot of people now, when they say narcissism, what they mean when it's mentioned in our culture now is that person lacks empathy. Okay. They are very entitled, or that means that they don't really care. They care more about themselves than they do about other people. So they put their needs above everyone else's, and they don't care about how they accomplish that or what the consequences are. So they don't care about hurting other people or making other people feel bad. So they don't really care about your feelings, and they tend to manipulate or use people in order to get their own needs met. And they feel like everyone owes them something. And so what that means is, like, if the best way to describe it is the entitlement piece. So, for example, when they're in a relationship with someone, they may feel like they can do whatever they want to in a relationship. They can cheat. They can, they can manage all the money or take all of your money or do other things to manipulate and sabotage the relationship, in other words, to get their own needs met. But if you were to do things to them, the same things that they do to you, then you would be a violator. And that would be, it's total hypocrisy,
right.
But they view that as being like, you violated me, you disrespected me, and now I have to do something to get you back because you disrespected me, and you're going to make me do something to you. And so that's that entitlement piece in which they feel like they can do things that you can't do. And then if they get out of line or they get out of character, it's everyone else's fault and not their own. When we're talking about narcissistic personality disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM for short, the DSM-5 now is what we're using. All of those elements are there. So you have the entitlement piece. You also have what's called grandiosity. Grandiosity means that I'm above everyone else, almost like I'm godlike.
Okay.
So there's this whole thing that which I'm over everyone, and they view themselves as being God. There's also a sense of paranoia there. In which they may view others as being, out to do them wrong in some way because they want so much to be like them, which is not really talked about as much, but you do get sometimes that paranoia. They are very irrational in terms of their thinking, meaning that they try to justify things any which way, wrong or right, to get their needs met. And it doesn't even make sense to anyone but to them. And so what you have, when you have that, you have people like the ones that I work with every day, which are pedophiles, you have murderers, you have people that do things that they're not supposed to be doing, misfits of society. The one thing, too, that is supposed to separate narcissistic personality disorder from people who are violators of the law, which means that they have no respect for authority, also known as antisocial personality disorder, is that narcissistic personality disorder, they walk the fine line between the legal realm, typically, is that they do just enough to not get themselves incarcerated, but that's not always the case. And so we have quite a few narcissistic personality disorder, albeit fewer than any other personality disorder in prison. However, there's an element of narcissism in the types of people that I work with in the prison system, if that makes sense. Right. So that the grandiosity, the lack of empathy, the manipulation, the total wanting to have control or being obsessed with control, where meaning that they want control of everything, and that's how they basically get their rocks off, is by manipulating and controlling. And there's certainly different types of narcissists. There's also narcissism itself runs on a spectrum, so you can have someone that's high on the narcissistic spectrum versus other people that fall in line somewhere else. So basically what that means, all narcissism is not created the same.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, when you talk about the different types of narcissism in the high and, the spectrum, can you tell me what does it look like for someone who may be at a lower spectrum of narcissism?
Okay, so yeah, sure. So that person can definitely be entitled, and feel like they're above other people and may manipulate and get their way, to a certain extent. However, I think the biggest piece is going to be the empathy piece.
Okay.
Meaning that there's some level to which they care about how their actions impact others.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yes.
Whereas on the high end, they don't really care. They don't really care, and then their traits are way up a notch. So, for example, on the lower end of the spectrum, you might have someone that feels entitled in certain areas. They may feel entitled to sex. They may feel entitled to your income. They may feel entitled to certain aspects of things. They may even lie and manipulate to get those things from you. But that's only going to be a certain extent, if you will. It's almost kind of like level 1, 2, and 3,
right.
In which you have people that do it a little bit for, maybe survival and just maybe that they know how they do it. And then you have people that do it so much that it is almost like they're way out there. They're lying so much that they actually start to believe it.
Yes.
This becomes this becomes their reality, and they will paint a portrait so clear that it becomes their reality. And it's like, oh wow, it's you actually believe the stuff that you're giving me, and it's so just unbiased. And they will try to pull other people into their reality. So that's another hallmark characteristic, is trying to recruit other people to fight. They'll fight their battles for them. So you might see them like pulling in their mom. You might see them pulling in coworkers, right? Because the other part of their characteristics is to be very charming, right? But there's a facade behind the charm, or other people call it a mask. But the part of that mask is to be charming to other people and present themselves in a positive light, or to always present themselves in such a way that people are so impressed by them or so enamored by them. And so that's what you'll find with it, especially if you're in a relationship with one, is that, people are going to maybe more likely to believe that person because they put on such a huge amount of superficial charm.
Yes,
but
yes.
The other hallmark too is their inability to have a stable relationship. And so that's going to always be your hallmark detector. And a lot of times what you will see in folks like that is what I'd like to call the victim or the white knight syndrome, meaning that they always paint themselves as like a savior to someone else. I had to save my ex-wife in our divorce. I had to save my child in our divorce with my ex-wife because she's so terrible, and I had to do all these things, and whoa, I ran in and saved the day, and I got all these scars from battle, but I saved the day, and I saved, my kid. And then the victim is someone who's always being persecuted. Someone is always doing something to me, and I'm this poor, defenseless little lamb,
right.
And things like that. And so, they tend to not have a great history in their relationships, or, even with the relationships that they do have, they're typically not healthy because they're trying to manipulate or get something from the people around them. So the proof is always going to be in the pudding there. And again, that's going to be the spectrum there in terms of what you look like, in terms of the degree in which people are doing these things. You have folks that are doing this a little bit, medium, and then you have folks that is all they are doing 100%, and it doesn't even matter. They're just so involved in writing their own story that they are just not even, their thinking isn't even reality based anymore. It's just like, I'm on this thing, I want to get what I want. And I see that a lot when I work with people that are, it's almost like they're delusional in their lies that they tell. For example, I've worked with a pedophile, and this is not to say that all narcissists are pedophiles, because they're not. But this is to say absolutely every pedophile that I've worked with, meaning someone who seeks out a sexual gratification from children, absolutely every single one of them that I've worked with is always a narcissist. So it doesn't, not every narcissist is a pedophile, but every pedophile is absolutely narcissistic. And just to give you an idea of their delusional thinking, you may have someone, that says, oh, well, I didn't attack this child, but this 2-year-old, 3-year-old, or 4-year-old came on to me. She threw herself at me. And it's like, okay, they paint this picture of this child trying to be a sexually provocative being when they don't even necessarily have the capacity to do that. But that's a story that they paint, to try to defend themselves and make it seem it so that it was everyone else but me. They never ever take responsibility, which is another hallmark. They're never ever going to apologize. So you may get like if you do get an apology, it's going to be a fake apology, something to the effect of, I'm sorry you feel that way.
Okay.
Or the apology that you do get is going to be in an effort to try and obtain something else, meaning that they have an ulterior motive to get another need met. And so you have a lot of narcissistic personality types that are completely obsessed with sex. You have those that are completely obsessed with physical appearance, meaning that you have some that are like always working out. Like you can see this stuff on social media, like you see people who are always posting pictures of their bodies or of themselves always working out and, doing all this relentless exercise to make their body look good, or looking in the mirror and doing these shots of themselves in provocative manners, showing a lot of skin. And it's like, whoa, look at me and compliment me on how I look. And then you have those narcissistic types that are obsessed with intelligence and may not be so much in tune with the sexual or physical aspect, but they're out to prove how intelligent, how brilliant they are. So I'm such a scholar, my scholastic abilities or my knowledge capabilities are godlike. So I'm over everyone else because I'm such a genius.
Do you think we all have narcissistic traits?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, we're all on the spectrum somewhere. We all have narcissistic traits. So yes, absolutely.
So how do we keep that from creating unhealthy behaviors in relationships?
There's a number of ways in which we can do this, right? And again, it depends on where we're at in the spectrum. The number one thing I'd like to say is going to therapy. Again, if you have a true narcissistic personality disorder or someone who's on the high end of the spectrum, they're not going to want to do therapy at all because they're not going to perceive themselves as having the problem.
Okay.
Everyone else around them is going to be the problem. But if you're on the low or medium end of the spectrum, having an objective personality to talk with and tell you about these things, keeping your own self in check is one way to do it. And if they're on the low end of the spectrum or the medium end, folks who have narcissistic traits would actually like therapy because they're going there to talk about themselves. They're going to be great at it because they're all about me. This is all the attention is going to be on me, whether it's negative or positive attention. So they're going to feed into that. The other piece of it is too, is that, it's going to, with anything else, when you want to keep things in check or when you want to be present for other people, you have to also be mindful. So there has to be some level of awareness. And with narcissistic personality folks or folks who have narcissistic characteristics, there is a lot of research, and as well as in my work, that shows that they are aware. They just don't care. Right. So there has to be a motivation to change, in essence. So if I want to keep anything in check, I have to be willing to do the work and be motivated to change because I want to obtain something, meaning that I want to be married. I want to have a solid marriage. I want to be in a good partnership. I want to have stable friendships and things. So you always have to be willing to look at the common denominator, which is you, and say, okay, this is how I'm contributing to all these things, and they're not always willing to do that.
I want to talk a little bit about being in relationships. What is it like being in a relationship with someone who may have some type of narcissistic personality disorder, and why are women expected to maintain those relationships?
Okay, so what's it like basically for a woman to be in a relationship with someone who's narcissistic? And why are we expected to maintain the relationships? Well, let me answer the last part of the question first.
Okay.
I think women in general are looked down upon when they are single or when they're not in a relationship, especially older women.
Yes.
It's viewed as a negative thing. You're viewed as an old maid or spinster or what have you. And so there's always this pressure for a woman to be in a relationship. At least, that's how I've experienced it, and that's how a lot of my clients who I see in my private practice have experienced it. Like, there's pressure, like, when are you going to get married? Or, why have you been single so long? Or, when are you going to fix your hair up so you can catch a man? And a way to catch a man is through his stomach. And why don't you go out and buy some makeup and some lingerie and get your hair done so you can, look presentable to catch you one. And, so there's all of that sort of societal, cultural things. Even if you're looking at TV, if you're looking at reality TV, if you're looking at a commercial, a woman is expected to be a sex symbol specifically for the goal of catching a man.
Right.
You can catch more flies with honey than you can with vinegar, right? And the objectivity behind that is that you are going to catch a man, and you need to, look your very best and do it. And if you are single, being single, it was always like the dirty word, like, what's wrong with you?
Right.
If you were single, especially if you're older and single, man, your life is gonna be terrible if you're not married by the time you're 30. So there's traditionally been a lot of rush and a lot of anxiety for women to get older, and to also, I think one of the primary reasons is to have children, to have a family and have children by the time they get to be a certain age. If you are an older woman and you're having children, that's not cool. A lot of people view it as like, oh my gosh, you're too old to be having children, or, there's a lot of these opinions there. And typically, in general, I feel like there's just been a lot of opinions by society forced on women about what they should do and how they should look and what's going to make them happy, as opposed to the individual looking inward and seeing what makes them happy. So it's almost forced down your throat, and then there's a lot of anxiety and panic around women around obtaining a relationship and sustaining one. And then if you can't sustain one, it's like what's wrong with you?
Exactly.
And then, and so just to answer your question, I think that women are expected to maintain any relationship.
And that's so unhealthy. That's so unhealthy for women. we suffer so much in the end because of that.
Correct. Correct.
And it's
But a
so
lot of
sad.
women stay in a relationship because they, one, want to have a family. So they have this idealistic view of, I want to have a family, I want to be married because that's what I've been told that I should do.
Yeah.
And two, because of failure. You know, if I end this relationship or I walk away from this marriage, then I have failed. And how is that going to look to everybody that I know?
That's exactly right. That was one of the motivations for me to stick out the relationship that I was in. And that relationship lasted for 3 years. And I tell everybody it lasted for 3 years longer than it should have because we were never supposed to be together. But it was, for me, it was more of I can make this work, or I can prove to people that even though this seems like a bad relationship, which it was, I can turn it around. And
Correct.
there was
And
nothing
again,
that I
that
could
comes from
do.
that fear of failure, maybe even that fear of abandonment or being alone, you know, fear of what other people are going to think. And, you know, a lot of that comes from, again, things that we've been conditioned to think. It can come from old childhood wounds in which we had a parent who abandoned us or someone in our lives that we're very close to that abandoned us very early. And we want to try to rewrite that script
Yeah.
where we can make a relationship with a person that is very similar to people that we've known in our lives work. So you have a lot of people that say, I don't want to be like my mom. I don't want to be like my dad. But then you turn around and you end up in these relationships that are exactly like the ones you didn't want to be in. And that's because, you know, good old social learning theory, right?
Yes.
Social learning theory teaches us that, you know, we're basically conditioned by our role model. So we do what we see around us. And so when we were growing up, if we grew up in a family of dysfunction, or we grew up around dysfunctional people or in a dysfunctional environment, more likely than not, I should say, our life is going to parallel that. And we have to do some serious work and be mindful and aware so that we don't end up repeating that cycle.
Yes, it definitely takes trial and error and learning from your mistakes. Do you believe narcissistic people can be in healthy committed relationships?
Again, it depends on where they're at in the spectrum and if they're willing to do the work. So if they're on the high end of the spectrum or even the medium end of the spectrum, and I don't think so. No.
No? Okay.
Lower end, lower on the spectrum, then yes, it's possible because again, it's not. Again, they have some awareness, and not to say that the folks that are on the high or medium end don't have awareness about what they're doing, but folks on the lower end are more likely to reel things in and maybe even seek treatment because even with narcissistic folks, they still have other issues, right? They still have other issues in which they may seek out treatment for. The key piece about folks who are narcissistic is that although they present themselves as being entitled or grandiose above other people, the key piece to keep in mind is that they actually feel empty. And emptiness causes them anxiety and depression. Those feelings, they don't identify it that way. They may lash out and act in ways that are considered to be angry or in a rage, but in all actuality, they feel empty. They also feel unattached. And folks who are on the higher end, they actually prefer that and they're okay with that until they want something, and then they become very parasitic in nature. But folks on the lower end may be more likely to say, I want to change how I feel, and I don't want to be this way. To do that. And so again, it takes work, it takes motivation to do the work, because again, I have a lot of people that I see that by the time they get to me, they basically have gotten themselves in a whole heap of trouble. And so they're in prison or what have you. And so they have to come see me whether they want to or not, because they basically have gotten, disciplined to this point. And so even when they come see me, though, folks who are on the higher end, they're kind of using therapy to their own manipulative benefit. They want to see what they can get out of it. They want all the attention to be on them, even if it's negative attention, but they also want to see what they can get out of, coming to see me. So for example, offenders that I work with in a prison may say that, and there's a protocol that we have to follow when someone says that they're suicidal. But they may say that they're suicidal because they want a better living condition. They don't want to live in a cell with another person, and they shouldn't have to live in another prison cell with another person. They should get to have their own cell in the nicest part of the prison and eat the best food. So they're going to say that there are these things to try and get all of these prison perks, if you will. And so you see a lot of that.
I read somewhere, maybe it was on Psychology Today, where they talked about how narcissists, they enjoy spreading and arousing negative emotions to gain attention. So to garner any type of attention, they will say or do something, even if it's negative.
Right, correct. And I think that's the key piece that you'll have to, we should be mindful of in a relationship. Especially when you start a relationship, which I think, going back to your last question, I'm thinking I'm starting to remember it now. But I think when you get it, I think you had asked me, can narcissists be in a relationship or something like that? And I think their version of a relationship, or their definition of a relationship, and a person who is not narcissist or very on the low end, or may only have low traits, is going to be very different. So for example, they're going to seek out a relationship just to one, get attention. Okay, I want him or her focus all on me, even if it's negative. So in the beginning, they're going to be charming. They're going to really lay it out because they want you to worship them. They want you to fall in love with them and think that they're great and wonderful. And it's going to be also, typically in my experience, it's very quickly. And so when I say that, the relationship is going to move and fast forward. So these are going to be people that want to have sex with you quickly. These are people that want to say that you're my girlfriend or boyfriend quickly. These are people that want to move in with you quickly. These are people that want you to have their child quickly. And these are people that want to get married or have some type of commitment to them quickly, right? And the commitment, again, is going to be viewed differently. Their version of commitment is going to be different than your version of commitment. You might think of commitment as like a everlasting happy marriage where we run off into the fields together and it's happily ever after. Their version of commitment is going to be, you belong to me. And so you're going to be almost like an object of some kind that they own, which is why you see the hypocrisy, with infidelity or, even abusive behaviors, meaning that you can't do to them what they do to you because they own you. You belong to them. You are my property. And so as my property, when you get out of line, you have to be punished accordingly. And so you're gonna see a lot of that instability there. You're gonna see a lot of that anger and rage and lashing out and that hypocrisy when they feel like you've done something wrong to them, persecuted them, or violated their expectations of you. And the interesting thing about this is you may not even know what it is. That's how delusional the thinking can get sometimes is that you don't even know what you've done to violate them. I mean, but they've justified it, their behavior in their mind by any means necessary. And so you may not have a clue, but they have something in which they've dreamt up to their mind that actually justifies what they do. And so that's the kind of stuff that you're going to see. And so when you ask me, can you have a relationship with a narcissist? Again, it depends on the spectrum, right? And it also depends, not only does it depend on the spectrum in which that person is on, it also depends on the spectrum in which you're on and how much a person like you, is willing to bend and adjust and is willing to write a false script in your head to stay in a relationship, right? Because the fact of the matter is that if you're in a relationship with a narcissist, the one thing you lose in that relationship is self-preservation. So you're really not valued as a human being. Your feelings aren't valued. You're getting manipulated, you're being controlled, you're getting used and typically abused somehow. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be the hallmark. And so the relationship that you have with a narcissistic individual is going to be abusive. I mean, you can call it a relationship, but it's going to be a dysfunctional, unhealthy, and typically filled with abuse. It's also going to be a roller coaster. There's going to be up and down, and then if you try to leave, you can invoke rage. You can invoke, violence in that person. Not saying that you would be the cause of that, but it's saying that may be the likely way that they lash out, because their means is to try to get control over you and to break you down and bring you back in line. Like, what were you thinking trying to walk away from me? How dare you try to do that? And so, you hear a lot of this kind of stuff on Lifetime movies, right? Lifetime movies are notorious for having these kind of things where, these men say to these women, if you leave me, I'll kill you. And that is very real. And I don't mean to say it with men, because women do it too. There's a lot of famous cases in which I've seen and which I've worked with, in which women and men have done this, not just in their relationships, romantic relationships, but also in relationships with children. You see it a lot with children, in which children are violated in some way. And it could be their own children, or it could be someone else's children, because a narcissistic person is going to try to control or engage in a relationship, as we say, with someone who they perceive to be more vulnerable. And children are the perfect victim for them. Children, family members, so you can see a lot of incestuous relationships. Again, I'm not saying that all narcissists are incestuous, but I am saying that folks who are incestuous are always narcissistic. And so they're going to pick on easy prey and easy victims. And so the relationship they have is one in which they feel like they can gain the upper hand and have that at all times and do with what they wish, even throw you away when they wish, but you better not move on, because you can only move on when they say you can move on. So yeah, that's kind of the way that can go. It's very just up and down, and just it drives you insane, but it's completely chaotic. And so that's typically what those relationships are going to look like. I've never seen one in which someone is with a narcissistic person and they're happy all the time. There's no arguing. There's no, things are well. There's, we're very close and very intimate. And that's going to be the other thing that the relationship is going to lack as well, is true intimacy. Because with intimacy, there has to be vulnerability, yes. And a narcissistic person is not one to be vulnerable.
Well, you brought up some good points, and there are two questions I want to ask you, but the one I want to go with first, because you talked about being unattached, and you just talked about how narcissistic people are not open to being vulnerable. Do you think that narcissism and attachment styles kind of go hand in hand? Because as you were speaking, I could clearly get good ideas of the avoidant attachment, because that's classic avoidant attachment, whether you want to be attached but you don't want people to get too close, so you do things to push people away.
Absolutely.
You want to
Absolutely.
maintain your independence, but you want people in your life, but it's almost for your own gain.
Correct.
And
Absolutely, yeah. I definitely think that there's a lot to go with attachment style, and most people, I would say 98, 99% of narcissistic people that I work with typically had a narcissistic parent.
that hit the nail on the head, because I was gonna go there. Okay,
Mm.
so it's pretty much, so obviously attachment styles are birthed from childhood. So when you have a narcissistic parent, they can create, or they build that environment for a child to have that avoidant or dismissive attachment style, and then they too become that same narcissistic person that their parent was.
Correct, or even more so. But one thing I want to say and be very clear about with narcissistic personality disorder is that, or any personality disorder, because I've worked with a range of personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality, and antisocial personality disorders are all the three that I work with. And even dependent personality, I've worked with that as well. But all of those things, or all of those personality disorders, are always deeply rooted in trauma of some kind. Is what I found, is that I don't know that I have ever worked with someone with any of those disorders that was not exposed to a level of trauma and dysfunction at home. Sure, they might start out saying, everything was great. I had great parents, right? Because they want to paint this picture of being charming and lovable and charismatic. But if you start to dig a little deeper, if they allow you to, again, this depends on the spectrum, you will find out that there's a lot of dysfunction, or even, other ways in which we find out is, having the parent interact, or seeing the parent or whomever their guardian was interact with them. And you can see the interactions between them and their parent, and almost see that. I've actually had a friend, or I shouldn't say a friend, but an associate, I guess you could say, that I worked with, that had a lot of narcissistic traits. And then I met his parents, and then I was just like, oh gosh, I see exactly where he got it from. And it wasn't, I wasn't like trying to assess him, but it was so obvious, and that the behavior that was demonstrated by his parents were so inappropriate for the setting. But again, it's attention, and we were at like a special event, but this person is trying to get all the attention towards themselves. So, yeah.
Another thing that I wanted to talk about really quickly, and it's purely because it's something that you maybe have touched on, and it really sparked interest. You talked about the clients that you work with, and you
Yes.
also talked about, clients, or these people may have killed their partners, or those Lifetime movies, and that
Yeah.
just reminded me, I live in Louisiana, and Louisiana currently ranks number 2 among the deadliest states for women.
Mm.
And it's just, I see it a lot, where there are women who are being killed by their ex-boyfriends, their husbands, their significant partner. And do you think in those situations that those partners are do have that narcissistic personality disorder, and how can people understand it in those domestic violence situations?
I do think that, they're going to have some definite narcissistic traits, especially if they're going across the line. It's probably going to be more, it may be, and I don't know them and I don't know the cases per se, but you're going to see a lot of narcissistic and antisocial characteristics typically. And again, and so when looking at that, again, there's that entitlement piece, that feeling that I own you and you better not leave me, or you better, do what I tell you to do type of thing. And so those are, and the other characteristic piece is rage. A lot of times you see with narcissistic and antisocial people, you see rage, and rage is not, a lot of people think rage is anger, and it's not. Rage is, it's typically depression turned inward, but it explodes exponentially, in which they see red. They're not thinking objectively. They're going to do what they need to do to get control of the situation by any means necessary. So that means violence, death. They may need to stalk or intimidate in some way. They're really going to try to reel in the situation and get it to go the way that they want it to go, the way that they view it in their minds. So there's a lot of irrational thinking involved behind that. That's not anger management. That is way beyond anger management, and that's basic offender treatment. And so those are things that we need to be looking at. But the one thing I will say about that, the relationships that you brought up, is that there's always telltale signs of that, and I've written about that on my blog, and I've spoken about that on my podcast in terms of red flags that we want to look for in relationships like that. In either, meaning the people who stay in them want so very much to stay in a relationship, or they kind of fall back into it when that person is on again, off again, or they don't want to be alone, or they justify it for children, or they justify it, in terms of failure and forgiveness, XYZ. They find some other sort of forgiveness, way to forgive the situation and get back into it. Or they can purely stay into it out of intimidation and fear. Fear that, if I leave him, I'm going to, I'm going to suffer some dire consequences, so I can't leave. However, the other component of that, the victim is, the way that it works being the victim is isolation typically. That person is typically isolated from their family, friends, or loved ones, or the former life that they had, which they were very involved with work and other outside activities. And so that relationship with that abusive individual becomes their everything. And so they really may feel like they don't have anywhere to go to for support, or they may start to become just as irrational in their thinking and say, it's not that bad that I need to go to a shelter. It's not that bad that I need to seek help from a professional. It's not that bad. Or, if I just do this, or if I just do that, he or she may straighten up, if I walk on these eggshells.
Well, you already touched on this point, but it sounds like when you're in a relationship with a narcissistic partner who's on the higher end, 9 times out of 10 those relationships become abusive, whether it's emotionally abusive, physically abusive, or mentally. In some way, they do become abusive. Would you agree?
They're always abusive, 100% of the time. Okay. Always abusive. Correct.
Yeah. Last thing, and you kind of touched on this too before we go. Do you think there's a way to create and maintain boundaries with a narcissistic partner? Is that such a thing, or should you completely cut it off?
So I think that, again, if your partner's on the high end of the spectrum, the one thing that a narcissistic partner is not going to stand for is boundaries, right? They want absolute and total control. So boundaries is like a no. So you can't really have a narcissistic partner and boundaries. The way, if you leave the relationship or you want to enforce boundaries with someone who is narcissistic, then you have to do it away from them. So you can't be engaged with a relationship, or you can't be engaged with a deep relationship, because there's narcissists all around us, right? We have them, they work with us, and they're at the bank, they're everywhere. But you can't be engaged in a relationship on a deeper level. So you have to make sure that you keep that relationship very superficial at all times. Hi and bye. I only do business with this person, if that's a place where you can take it. Now, if you've been intimate with someone who was narcissistic, then the best advice that I can give, or the best tip I can give, is to walk away and have absolutely no contact with that person. I don't think that you can be friends in that way. Of course, they may turn on the charm and what have you, but definitely not friends, or, let's go get each other a birthday present. I'm going to go to so-and-so's birthday party. No, I absolutely think that the best way to be is cut that person out of your life, because once you open up that door, they're still going to think that they have that power and control. And saying that. But again, there's also different levels to it too. If you have someone who's on the lower end, or you have a parent that you still want to keep a relationship with, a superficial relationship is more than likely going to be the best. And that's something in which I would talk with a therapist about, specifically one who's trained in how to navigate those channels and how to identify those patterns, because that's going to be what helps you and what keeps you sane at the end of the day. Because again, it's all about self-preservation.
Well, you touched on something that I would absolutely love to have you speak again on, and that is narcissistic parents. There's so many things I want to ask you about, but we obviously don't have the time.
Sure.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and give us a little bit of insight on narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder. I really appreciate you.
Yeah.
Do you have any last comments or any last thoughts that you would like to share?
I hope that, whenever I do these things, I try to, because I wear so many hats, in talking with the legal professionals and talking with the Department of Corrections and things like that. So my hope is that your audience understood what I was talking about, and that I said it in so many, layman's terms. I always try to do that when I'm on a podcast. I try to break it down so that people can, a light bulb can go off and they understand what I'm talking about, and then they can say like, oh, that's me, or that's so-and-so that I know and that I completely understood that. I definitely try to do that. I certainly try to do that in my own podcast, A Date with Darkness, which is dedicated to victims of abusive relationships, and I definitely have an emphasis on narcissism. I'm always happy to answer any questions that people may have, so they can feel free to reach out to me at drnataliejones@gmail.com, all spelled out, all one word. And they can always view me on my website, www.drnataliejones.com, if there's any questions or concerns, and I'm always happy to certainly explain that. And I'm always happy to come back on and break it down even further and talk about mothers and things like that. So, whatever questions your listeners may have or they want to hear, I'm certainly happy to, help them out with that.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for listening to another episode of the My Lotus Moments podcast with Hope. If you enjoyed this episode, share the Apple Podcast with a friend or someone you know who needs it. And Please take a few minutes to rate and review the show because that is how other people find us. And if you're talking about this episode online, don't forget to use the hashtag MyLotusMoments and tag me at JustMoreHope on Instagram and Twitter. Until next time, thanks for listening.